Today I will be arguing against Timothy Gao's claim that the nuclear bombing of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary. And his secondary claims are that the bombings ultimately saved more lives than they took, and that the second bombing was necessary to secure the Japanese surrender. And his third claim is that the bombs were primarily valuable for their shock and awe effect rather than their pure destructive potential. And fourth, that the nuclear strikes established a creditable U.S. nuclear strategic deterrence in the opening years of the Cold War. So he claims that since the bomb ultimately saved more lives, he claimed that the nuclear bombs were a necessity because in the end they saved more lives. But this claim is based on the assumption that the only way other than nuclear bombing the two cities is a homeland invasion that would result in high casualties. But this is a false dilemma because overwhelming evidence support that Japan would have surrendered readily without a nuclear strike and without a homeland invasion. According to Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, director of Cold War Studies at UC Santa Barbara, the Soviet Union's declaration of war, not the atomic bombing on Japan, secured the Japanese surrender. According to Norman Cousins, consultant to General MacArthur during the American occupation in Japan, General MacArthur found no military jurisdiction to the nuclear strikes. In fact, he thought it was the retention of the emperor that secured the surrender. And according to the strategic bombing surveys commissioned to assess bombings during the Second World War, Japan would have surrendered by the end of 1945 without atomic bombing, without Soviet Union's involvement, and even without any planned invasions. My opponent also claims that not just one bombing, but two bombing was necessary to secure Japan's surrender. Because Japan at that time, if there was only one bombing, they could just explain it away with some natural disasters. But with the second bombing, it would wipe out all the rumors on that. But my opponent's argument is based on shaky ground. His source, James Robert, who implies that the bombing of Nagasaki undermines rumors that the Hiroshima catastrophe was not atomic, and established that the United States was able to make more atomic bombs, is a post hoc fallacy. Just because two events are sequenced, first the second bombing and then Japanese surrendering, doesn't mean that the first caused the second. In fact, according to Jerome Hagan, director of Hawaii Pacific University, the attitude change of the Japanese, the wiping out the rumor, was caused by United States captive Marcus McDilda. When under interrogation, he bluffed to the Japanese that the Americans had 100 bombs and were going to target Tokyo and Kyoto next. My opponent also claims that the bombs were primarily valuable for their shock and awe effect, rather than their pure destructive potential. But my opponent fails to elaborate on why the atomic bomb's shock and awe effect is relevant to its necessity. All his subpoints to that claim were explaining how conventional weapons were just as effective as nuclear weapons in killing people. In regards to his fourth claim, that the nuclear strikes established a creditable United States nuclear strategic deterrent in the early years of the Cold War. If you are to accept that claim, you would have to disregard any other way to establish deterrence against the Soviet Union. You would have to accept that this is the necessary way. That the only way to deter the Soviet Union is to bomb Japan. So, in sum, the bombings ultimately unlikely saved lives and actually took lives. And that the second bombing's necessity is based on shaky grounds, and that the shock and awe effect is irrelevant to the main claim, and that the nuclear strikes doesn't necessarily establish deterrence. The nuclear bombing of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were unnecessary.
Right, all the structural issues are fine. On the first point, I think this is where you've got your strongest information because you've argued that there are other causes of the conclusion of the war, and you offer some citation and some information to suggest that that is in fact true. I think you do need to discuss the advocates' evidence on this particular point in a little bit more detail. The counterclaims are okay, but how am I supposed to assess what has been said by you and what's been said by the advocate without a little bit more contrast? The notion of life-saving based on the invasion, for instance, the idea that invasion wouldn't be necessary, to me, that's the thing that is most essential here, and that I'm not sure that the Hasegawa evidence addresses that particular point. It seems to be pretty conclusionary, in fact. The evidence from Cousins talking about MacArthur's perception of this is, I think, a little bit more relevant. If MacArthur is the chief military officer, the supreme commander in the Pacific region, and he didn't find it to be relevant. I think that it would be helpful if we had a direct quote on that. We're getting something secondhand there, so that's a little bit iffy. On the second point, you've got an interesting explanation of what's going on there. I think that there's an okay challenge on its relevance. The idea, although to me the idea that this guy who was captive said we had 100 bombs that we were ready to use, that seems to suggest that that's in fact what scared the Japanese into surrendering after the demonstration that the one worked, and we said, and we've got more. That seems to feed into the advocate's argument on that point. And then the whole thing about whether or not it was relevant to deter the Soviets, and that's a necessary issue. I think you're going around on circles on this one. I'm not sure that your answer is very complete. I'm not sure that the advocate's argument was that great either, but I'm not sure that your answer really does much to diminish the argument. It maybe raises some questions on the point. All right, thank you.